so much you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time.
Welcome to Is It Bad for the Economy, the podcast where we explore whether Trump's economic policies are helping, hurting, or just a load of hot air. I'm Democratic strategist Kobi Tirey, and I'm trying to figure out how Democrats can finally get the credit they deserve for their economic performance. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Banker Bill, the anonymous financial practitioner doing some great work at a bank you've definitely heard of. And we're also joined by our first ever guest, Wall Street Journal trade and economic policy reporter, Gavin Bade. I know Gavin is a guy who throws a great jazz party and randomly went to high school with my girlfriend, but Banker Bill is a big fan of his reporting and was like, we got to have him on. And not only did Gavin say yes, but as you'll hear, he's actually become a pretty big fan of Banker Bill and of the show. So thank you so much, Gavin. And thank you to all of our loyal listeners who got us this far. Turns out you've been in pretty good company. Folks, I tried to put together a tight outline and keep this conversation out of the weeds. I did not stand a chance. Banker Bill and Gavin got straight into it, so we will too. Enjoy.
It's a good time to talk because, we're going to talk tariffs today, and we had some big news on Friday, a news dump, so to speak, of, Trump stepping back from a number of his reciprocal tariffs, exempting, a couple hundred different food and ag products in a bid to address, affordability concerns. So that's some would say a pretty big tacit admission that these tariffs actually have been raising prices for consumers for a while. And I'm just curious to see what's going to happen. We went to the grocery store today. I'm like, okay, are the plantain chips going to be cheaper in 2 months than they are now? Because that was one of the things, bananas, plantains, things like that, they got exempted from these tariffs. So I'll be curious to see what happens. After the COVID inflation shock, you didn't exactly see, corporations rushing to reduce prices when the supply chain issues were resolved. So I don't know if that's going to have its intended effect. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about.
Why were the foodstuffs tariff from the beginning? I understand that those tariffs on the foodstuffs went into effect in August. So 2 months later, they pulled them back. So it's not like there was some revelation that we couldn't get this stuff locally.
Yeah, I think it's, what is actually going on in their mind. I think, it's just part of a shift away from, they were originally very maximalist with these tariffs, trying to look very tough. And I think over time have realized, oh, this is actually becoming an issue on some of these products that we don't make here. There have always been some people in the administration's orbit, who have called for more of a kind of nuanced approach to this. But I think early in the administration, you had, especially when Howard Lutnick was really involved, the Commerce Secretary he's a very, maximalist kind of personality. And he kept saying no exceptions, no exemptions for anything. And over time, it just, really became clear that, wow, we're actually seeing some price increases here. It's funny because, I mean, that sort of, it was an article of faith among some people in the administration for so long that, no, the other country pays the tariff, right? And while it's true that exporters may adjust their prices a little bit, Bill, you were saying Goldman Sachs estimated that 80% of the tariff impacts were being borne by U.S. consumers. I think that, especially after the kind of electoral shock or mini shock they got a couple Tuesdays ago, they said, oh, shoot, really, we need to modulate here. So, of course, they're not admitting that this is a backtrack, but it most certainly is.
I think it was between 85 and 90 cents of every dollar in tariff revenue was being paid for by either the U.S. corporate, so the local domestic firm, or the U.S. consumer. Yeah.
That's a lot. And that's a lot more than, someone like, Scott Bessent, more than he would cop to, more than he's said, in congressional testimony and stuff. So I think you're just seeing them kind of crashing headlong into reality right now. The grocery prices are higher. And people don't like that. They're underwater on the economy. They need to shift. So yeah, in more ways than just one, I think they're kind of modulating their approach here.
What does that mean for the tariff revenue, which was used as a cudgel from everything for stimulus checks to new investments to reducing the deficit?
I think, it'll bring it down a little bit from what it would be. I haven't seen any estimates quite yet of, okay, taking all of those products, those exempted products, add them up, and how would that affect revenue? I'm sure we'll see some estimates coming out, early this week. I wouldn't expect that it's going to be too big of a hit. We're still importing a lot of different consumer goods. We'll see how much further they go with this. I could see these exemptions kind of expanding over time as well. And so maybe that gives a little bit of price relief for consumers going into the midterms. But like I said, I don't know if, once you let these corporations raise prices like this, a lot of times they don't bring them back down. So, I think we'll have to see how sensitive they are to that in the months to come.
Well, my big question is just, do we think this is here to stay? Are we convinced that these exemptions are going to be in place for the next 6, 12 months? Or is Trump just going to upend this again on a Truth Social post at 2 a.m.?
From now on, we are going to get walkbacks. They're negative on the economy. The economy was slowing when Trump came into office. We knew that. We knew that was part of the reason why inflation was coming down. They put the tariffs on, and it's been a straight line. Inflation's been going up since, on a year-over-year basis, since April, on basically any measure: CPI, CPI X food and energy, PCE, PCE X food and energy. I think maybe one of those four are going their way. The other three are up.
I think you'll see, from a broad perspective, mostly walkbacks, but they're also they're modulating which tariffs they're applying, right? So while they're kind of drawing back some of these reciprocal tariffs, they're also expanding other tariffs, these so-called Section 232 tariffs. These are the ones that are on individual industries. So steel and aluminum, automobiles. There's an investigation into semiconductors we expect to come out in the next few months. They're actually taking these and really dramatically expanding the scope of those tariffs. So like the automotive tariffs and the parts tariffs, there's actually a process where U.S. companies can apply and get more components covered by the tariffs. The same with the steel and aluminum ones. And so I think overall it's a walkback, but you're also seeing them kind of push forward on these Section 232 tariffs as well and expand those. And that's important because those are not very legally vulnerable, right? Like we had just had the Supreme Court hearing on the reciprocal tariffs. By all accounts, did not go well for the administration. So they're thinking, oh, if we can just lean on the 232 tariffs, expand their coverage, maybe we can get most of the economy and most of the sectors that we want covered, the really strategic ones to them, like steel and aluminum, like automobiles. Maybe that is a more appropriate use of the tariff authority than just covering everything. I think the more serious protectionist voices in and outside of the administration, that is what they are kind of pushing for right now. So I think that that's what we'll see in the months going forward too.
So the tariff revenue has been about 30 billion for August, September, and October.
Month or combined?
A month. Do we think that's going to go down in November, or are those tariffs going to just all even out?
I think it'll go down, but not significantly. I'm having a hard time kind of thinking about, okay, how much are
Right.
these, however many dozens of, HTS lines, how much of US trade does that
I
really
think the
apply
consumer
to?
basket for food is like 80% domestic, 20% foreign on produce and
Yeah.
groceries. So if they cut that, I mean, there'd be some relief, but that's not where you'd probably see the biggest component.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're going to see, obviously, we're going to buy a lot of tariff goods over the holidays, right? Even as consumer sentiment is a little bit down, there's still going to be more consumption around the holidays. And so you'll see that, it'll kind of even out from that. So I don't know really how that's going to play into the estimates. So, I mean, we'll see we'll see what they come back with. I think another issue is, now that we have this kind of tariff pause with China, or this kind of tacit agreement not to do too much over the next few months. Well, what does that mean for future tariff actions? Are we going to, put tariffs on legacy semiconductors coming from China, for instance, as part of that 232 investigation? What about the critical minerals investigation? My understanding is that the Chinese did not bring that up during these talks. And so there's a lot of these 232 investigations that are open into specific industries. And so do they give China a pass on that? Do they kind of kick the can down the road? I mean, there's a lot of open questions right now. And I think in a way they've just painted themselves into a corner on these tariffs because they went so maximalist, first of all, and they want to look so tough, and it underpins all of their negotiating leverage. But now the only thing they can really do is pull back. And I think that's the case with China as well. Xi Jinping doesn't believe that Trump can sustain a 100% tariff on the world's second largest economy because we just can't. The markets won't tolerate it. And so whenever he goes and throws out that sort of threat, it just doesn't have that much sway with them anymore. So I think you saw them really going into these most recent discussions with the Chinese kind of in a worse negotiating position than before because they had gone so maximalist. So maybe a case of too much too fast on multiple fronts here.
So we've been arguing that the United States has lost a lot of leverage and that China's playing hardball precisely because they can in this moment. Do you think that's right? Or do you think that we're seeing a de-escalation that could actually be in place for the long term after this last round of talks?
I think that we see a pause, but I'm very skeptical on how long this is going to last, right? How long until the U.S. does something that we think is outside of the scope of the deal and the Chinese disagree and they retaliate, right? I give it a few months probably, but you never really know. I do think that the Chinese went into this round of negotiations in a better position just because they really realized and were able to demonstrate the chokehold they have over the U.S. economy with their control of rare earths processing, right? That's not going away over the next year and a half in the most optimistic scenario for the US. And I think, like I said, the Trump administration kind of painted themselves into a corner by going so maximalist, 150, 45% tariffs, is what we were looking at earlier this year. And they just demonstrated that the markets will not tolerate that, right? The US economy cannot tolerate that. And they don't have the stomach for it. And so, every time they come back with something, the Chinese know they can kind of match us. And it's interesting, talking to like big trade lawyers around the city, you have discussions with a lot of people. And I remember sitting around a big dinner table at one of these salon dinners, and everyone, whether they were Republicans, Democrats, former administration officials from both parties, everyone agreed that China got the best of that deal and got the best of Trump in the last negotiating round. So I think they're struggling on this front. And I think you can tell as well because as the economy has been getting worse for them, they've been getting more sensitive to any sort of critical reporting on that. So when we reported a story out that said, yeah, the Chinese are really playing hardball, they think they've got Trump where they want him on this, Scott Bessent was so mad and came out to an event the next morning and said, oh, terrible Wall Street Journal this morning. They're taking dictation from the Chinese Communist Party, which is obviously patently ridiculous. But what do the conservative commentators like to say? Like a kick dog and a holler? I feel like they're really doing that. You know what I mean? You can see their kind of insecurity on this point. They came after us for possibly reporting on the pasta tariffs that are going to go into place next year if something doesn't change. They were mad about that. So I think they're really.
So wait a second. They are taking tariffs off on some goods, coffee, mangoes, bananas, some other stuff for staples that people eat every day. And
Yeah.
you tell me that next year they're going to put on tariffs on
Italian
spaghetti.
pasta. Spaghetti, Italian pastas. This is part
And
of.
so do you expect 2 months after those go into effect, they'll get rolled back?
I think that they will probably intervene in the process before these tariffs go into effect because this is a separate, like totally technocratic thing that goes on at the Commerce Department, and they've just gotten into a tiff with the Italian pasta companies and say you're not cooperating with the anti-dumping tariff probe, and so we're going to find you non-cooperative in this case, and we're going to slap these 91% tariffs, 92% tariffs on top of the 15% reciprocal tariff.
So predatory dumping of pasta at 90 cents a box.
Well, that's what they are. That's what they're saying. Obviously,
Gotcha.
this is part of a yearly review on these cases that has happened
Sure.
every year since 1996. And this time they have decided to find these pasta companies uncooperative and basically punish them and a dozen other suppliers of Italian pasta with these duties. Now, this
We
case
know
is
what's
not-
going on here.
Yeah.
We know what's going on here. This is just retaliation against the poor performance that the Republicans had with the Italian American community in New Jersey in university a couple of weeks ago.
On the China thing, I want to go back to
Yeah.
that for a second. I want to ask you, do you think there's a trade deal even to be had with China, or are they just going to maliciously comply or break the deal or just not abide by what was agreed to from the beginning?
That's a good question. I think there is a deal to be done simply because they don't mind buying commodities from us. But I think it'd be a very narrow deal, something akin to the phase one agreement from the first term, right? Like we're not going to be talking about doing anything about, the regulations of US firms in China. I don't think we're getting to the fundamental rules of their economy. Could we come to deals where they buy US LNG or they buy US soybeans, those very kind of basic level transactions? Sure, I think that benefits both economies. But other than that, I find it very difficult to go beyond and like strike what Trump was calling a phase two deal from the first term, where we really start to bring down some of these trade barriers in China and kind of change the inner workings of their economy. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think the Trump team has been preliminarily successful in doing that with other countries. They are getting some trade barriers reduced that the US has tried to do for years, right? Now, I don't know if any of that's going to stick. None of these are legalized trade agreements. They're all executive agreements. And if the IEEPA tariffs get thrown out in court, it could undermine those deals. The next president could undermine them. So it is all very temporary. But I am trying to give them some credit for where it's due for their, using this leverage with some countries to get some preliminary wins for the US. But again, it's all very tentative.
You mentioned the phase one agreement. I think it's that agreement which was signed or agreed to just before the pandemic started in 2020. Yeah. That is now under investigation for China not honoring its commitments. And
yes.
Based on what I've seen, you can't convince me that China has abided by their agreements. So why should we trust them again?
Yeah, I mean, they would say, oh, it's because of COVID that we weren't able to do that. I guess we have to trust them again because we want them to buy our stuff. If you're the Trump administration, you need to trust them again because we need to sell our soybeans somewhere. There was just no other outlet for them. And so it's kind of it's more of a necessity than a desire, I would say, on some of these products, right? And Trump wants to trust them because he likes to do a deal, and he always thinks that he can come back and enforce these deals on the back end. Now that investigation is interesting because we have that it's an open section 301 investigation to China that could, if we find them non-cooperative or non-compliant with this deal, that could result in tariffs on China as well. But as part of this deal, we wrote in a provision saying, we will basically kick the can down the road on this investigation, and we will continue negotiating with you until, at least for the next year. So I don't expect any tariffs coming out of that Section 301 for a few months here, just because that, I think, has been part of the agreement with the Chinese. We'll put that on hold while we, if you buy all these soybeans from us and we can continue talking, then maybe we won't hit you with those tariffs. But again, nothing is permanent in these things. So
I have no faith they'll live up to any of their commitments because they've shown under precedent no ability to do so themselves. They haven't on anything. They can blame COVID all they want. COVID was 5 years ago. They were slow on the 2017 through 2020 phases as well. And now you're telling me what? They're going to buy our soybeans again, but not as much? We should be finding a new market for the soybeans.
Banker Bill obviously is a strong proponent of this idea that the United States, in essence, needs to get NATO together, needs to get the whole world together, needs to form a trade alliance that's able to crack down and bully on China to get them to follow the rules. But we've been talking about that for so long now, and it feels like it's so distant based on the current trade policy. I kind of want to ask both of you guys, what is the best case scenario at this moment? Is it that we go and have that incredible alliance building and the entire world teams up and makes China follow the rules? Or is it that we just stop all of this trade war nonsense and go back to the status quo because that was mostly fine?
The best case?
Yeah.
Depends what you think would be the best is. At this point, for me, I think the most likely outcome is, given the recent rollbacks, further rollbacks of tariffs. And ultimately, China is now playing from a maximalist position where they want to go back to the way things were at 2016 and before that. And so where we end up is a situation wherein the U.S. rolls back a bunch of tariffs, finds a way to save face and have some credibility and PR, but there is no real agreement. It's back to where we were in 2016, and China is shown as the premier trade negotiator on the world stage. They already have the number one trade relationship with 140 odd countries. So
they have the chips. They've decoupled from us on the soybeans. They still have all their incredible exports to the rest of the world. It really does feel like they're winning. But for the US consumer, does anything matter besides low prices? The manufacturing's not going to come back. And if it is, it's not going to come back for another 5-10 years at the very least. But when we talk about the things the trade warriors want from the Chinese on the trade war, it's stuff like the ability for American companies to sell in Chinese markets, the ability for Americans to invest in Chinese markets like they
not going to happen. Markets. Not going to happen.
Well, okay. And my question is just do we even care about that anymore? If this is what escalation gets us?
I think the best case scenario from a US-China perspective is kind of, what you might call strategic decoupling, where we still have, some trade in consumer goods, non-strategic consumer goods, and we generally disconnect from them on national security, contingent sectors, right? Whether that, and, there's always a discussion about where you draw that line, right? And I think most people in Washington who are China policy analysts have a version of that thesis as their kind of end goal, right? Whether you're Jake Sullivan or Donald Trump or whoever. I think we're talking about how do we get there. And, I think we've made it arguably more difficult to do the kind of upside of that by having this, on again, off again trade war with them. I think it's the best case scenarios like cooler heads prevail on the common everyday trade, and you gradually through negotiations and mutual understanding kind of decouple the national security sectors. Whether that can be achieved, I'm not sure, but I think like that is what most policymakers here would say.
Well, I want to ask you about the flip side too, though, because I think we all feel like China's winning, but we also hear all these grumblings about weaknesses within the Chinese domestic economy that could bring them down any moment now. Do they feel like they're winning? Are they doing a little victory lap, or are they worried that their own house of cards is going to come falling down?
I think it's a little bit of both. I certainly think that they feel like, when I talk to my colleagues who have sources over there, I mean, if they feel like they had a good round of negotiations here and they were able to kind of bring the temperature of the situation down a little bit to a manageable level. Obviously, they've got a lot of challenges they need to address, and I'm not up on them enough to really talk about them intelligently. But I do think that they feel like they're in a good place right now relative to earlier in the year and probably relative to, during the Biden administration. So I think one thing that is challenging for them, though, is that the U.S. has made of some strides in getting other nations to stand up to China in some of these trade agreements. There are some tentative provisions in these, like in Southeast Asia, saying like, well, we don't want you to allow the Chinese to transship goods through your economies into the U.S. And we're going to set up rules of origin with you that prevent them from doing that. And I think that that is a big goal of the China hawks in this administration, is to prevent China from getting around our tariffs and other trade sanctions. So, there's been some tentative moves in that direction from these nations. But again, whether we can make any of these things stick is very, very much up in the air.
I would just add locally a couple of things to China. So their Chinese aggregate demand, their consumer demand, isn't nearly as good as the United States. How does that manifest itself? Is the Chinese, through their single party, the way that they do their economic planning, they keep everybody working. They produce all these goods, and they get that out of the country to whoever will take it. For a long time, we're the takers of that. Whatever the Chinese are making, they will dump on us. They have an aggregate demand problem where if other countries stopped importing their things for whatever reason, whether it was important stuff to bring in or not, purely discretionary things like sneakers or whatever, that would hurt China. That's the driver of China's economic model right now, is the export markets, because their local demand is poor. They're also still recovering from a Chinese property crisis where they overbuilt housing in almost all forms and regards. That's been going on for 5 years, and that hasn't come back, and that's contributing to the lack of aggregate demand. So I just want to make clear, I think the U.S. is right to pick a trade war with the Chinese. I think the way that it's being carried out or executed is the worst of ways in which it can be done. Nonetheless, if we change tack right now, we could still, quote, win it, depending on what your definition of winning is.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think what the administration has been trying to do is combat some of the outlets for that economic dumping, right? And trying to get Europe, Canada, Mexico to raise tariffs on China as well, or to open investigations into some of these sectors, like their electric vehicle sector. And I think that if you can ring fence the Chinese economy and prevent them from dumping their goods on many of these big consumer economies, then maybe you can really weaken them structurally over the long term. I think the Chinese are always looking at ways to get around this as well in different ways, right? Like I was in Ohio just this past week looking at this Chinese glass company, Fuyao, that set up a bunch of manufacturing facilities in the United States. And they are, allegedly using Chinese nationals to come in and undercut all of the US-based glass production for the automotive industry, for architectural glass, stuff like that. And they're expanding like gangbusters. So that's the question of what you would call internal dumping, them setting up a factory in another country or in this country. And
so this is illegal labor working in a US factory to sell glass.
Yeah.
Right. And these people aren't here legally. Wow.
So I mean, there's a lot of it's like a 3,000 person plant. There's a lot of Americans there as well, but there was a big immigration raid last year. There's a money laundering investigation. They were raided this year. So something seems to be going on in Dayton with this company. And they've got, just really expanding their market share in the US, taking it away from other companies here. And so there's a lot of consternation in Ohio and other states about it, and then kind of bubbling up in Washington as well. So they will find ways to get around these trade moves that we do as well.
I think it's important. That's why they should be exacting
Yeah.
and not in this multifaceted, hard to comply way, even if that ultimately means something that is reductionist or regressive. As we've discussed, you've made probably some people's head spins. 302, 301, 232, this section, that section, 90 odd pages, new pages of exemptions.
I'm sorry. I still can't believe that the Chinese are using cobbler elves against us in the trade war.
Yeah.
You mean like they have like they come in the dead of night, a factory pops up, they're bringing in Chinese workers illegally, they're building a whole bunch of stuff, selling it, and then before anybody notices, presumably they've either closed up shop or figured out a way to make it legitimate.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it's not exactly cobbler. This factory that I was looking at is actually the subject of that documentary American Factory that the Obama production company put on. They took over this big old GM Shutter GM facility. Bunch of tax exemptions from, incentives from the state. You got Sherrod Brown there and the Republican governor there. They have the big opening. But yeah, there's been some really interesting reporting of, okay, busloads of Chinese workers coming into a separate entrance at the factory. There was a big immigration raid. I talked to a security guard there who said, oh yeah, they would take in hundreds of Chinese workers each and every day. Some of them are like the ownership of the plant, but also a lot of manual workers as well. I should specify all of this is alleged. There appears to be multiple criminal investigations open here. I don't know where DOJ and DHS are at in like looking at this immigration case, but a lot of people would say there's something fishy going on there. It's the way the American economy works sometimes, right?
It's Hyundai, but actually evil and bad, unlike the Hyundai raid.
Right. And people are wondering, oh, well, if this is actually such a bad problem here, why are we not seeing more action? Wouldn't this be a great headline for the Trump administration? And so this is just one of the things that we're looking into right now. Look out for that one in the days and weeks to come here.
Before we move on from China, is there a small little quibble in the trade fight that's either been far dumber or far more interesting than we might have caught on just listening to the regular news? A classic when you study the EU. A classic one is the curvature of bananas. The EU passed a agriculture regulation in order to protect their consumers. They could only eat bananas with a certain curvature, because it turns out that bananas grown in Africa have a certain curvature and bananas grown in Central America have a certain curvature. That's how they got around it. Have we come up with any funny little?
I don't know of anything so specific as to that, but I think one of the things that I've been surprised about is like, okay, you have these tariffs and Banker Bill, I appreciate you kind of breaking it down because I know I'm getting so jargony with the different sections of the tariffs and stuff. But you've got the tariffs on individual industries, right? Those are the 232s, automobiles, steel and aluminum, others. Then the reciprocal tariffs, which are just on each specific nation. And then there was also a move. There was a big tariff exemption for small goods, small shipments. It was called the de minimis rule. It used to be if you got something from, a retailer in another country, maybe it's a Shein package. If it's under $800, it can come in tariff free. That is gone now. And so if you are ordering like a specialty product, something that is not going to come in on like a pallet size load, if you're ordering that from another country, now you're going to have to pay a tariff on that as well. We ordered something from, some soccer item for a friend's baby from a shop in the UK. The UPS man showed up to my door and made me pay a $40 tariff right there. He had a credit card scanner with him. And I'm like, that is crazy. Just the friction that puts into the global trade system. I hadn't, there's been some reporting on that, but I really saw that come home in my own life. Like, oh, you have to pay the tariff right at your doorstep, sir. That's insane.
We had 3 of those in my family this week, actually. One was my uncle went to Italy. He bought like a $6,000 painting and ended up having to pay $1,000 tariff, even though he was under the understanding that art is supposed to be exempt. Let me know if that's true. My dad is doing some work with a company overseas, and they get a free sample, like a free test sample for the thing that they're manufacturing. I think they're manufacturing it in India. He ended up having to pay a $5 tariff on the free sample kit, but the tariff itself was a 20-page document that had to be put together. So it feels like somebody's making more money on putting the tariff documentation together than the tariff itself. And then my brother lives in Germany, and my mom was sending him a birthday gift. And apparently, in retaliation, the EU now has a very strict limit on its de minimis exception. So apparently she looked it up and it's supposed to be 150, but she got to FedEx and they're telling her any gift that's more than $45, you have to pay a huge tariff on it. So he's actually going to have to pay to get his own birthday present in a couple of weeks here.
I mean, I think you can understand, from a certain standpoint, the motivations of protectionists in both parties who want to, protect certain, large manufacturing industries, national security concerned industries. I think it's much more difficult for, that argument to resonate with Americans over consumer goods like that. That's the type of thing that really, people look at and say, this is something that is not going to make me happy about the economy and the people who are running it, right? I'm trying to be even-handed with that, but those things I think really can annoy people over the long term.
Well, I think that gets me to the biggest question I actually wanted to ask you. As you're talking to the elites, the academics, the economists, and also some of the business leaders, what is their vibe? Because to me, it seems like there's two obvious options. Either it's K-shaped economy narrative, they're doing awesome, they're pumped, they're feeling great, or it's the cracks are starting to show in the economy and everybody's holding on for dear life, hoping that Trump comes to his senses, the economy comes to his senses, and this awkward moment ends. What's the vibe? Is it they're doing great and they wish folks at the bottom wouldn't get so upset? Or is it that they're kind of holding on for dear life, hoping that this chaos rolls over?
Yeah, like anything, I think it kind of depends on which segment of the elite you're asking, right? Like, I think the Trumpian segment in DC is still, by and large, very bullish about the economy, right? The stock market's going up. Oh, once these tariffs ripple through the economy and once we get rates down a little bit, you'll see more investment start to happen and we're going to really be roaring then. I see that among a lot of more corporate executives and Chamber of Commerce types, like the Dayton Chamber of Commerce chair when I was in Ohio this week, for instance, very bullish on the economy, says, oh, my manufacturers, everyone's hiring, people are planning new investments. We just got to get those rates down a little bit. Some of the stuff in the big, beautiful bill is going to help us as well. And we're going to really be investing and going, right? I see that among that class of people, the MAGA business owners, maybe petty bourgeois people, right? I think when you go into more of the professional managerial class or people who are not overtly MAGA, it's a much more difficult situation, right? I think normal everyday consumers are really feeling the pinch of prices. Even if they've got a price increase, they don't feel better off than they did at the beginning of the year. There's definitely a K-shaped economy narrative going on here for me and I know you guys have talked about that before, but it does seem like, people who are running businesses and people who have a little capital in the market feel like they're doing really well, right? But that bottom 2/3 of the economy is really struggling. And I definitely heard that when I was out in the Midwest this week. Yeah, I think I see the flip side of it among, the elites in Washington and people who are, going to the Met Club or the Neds Club. People with money are doing great, doing better than they were at the beginning of the year. People without that capital are not and feel like they're doing worse. So yeah, I guess K-shaped narrative is the only way you can describe it.
They're not worried about a bubble.
I mean,
you don't speak that into existence in the business community, Kobi. That's only for talking heads. We never actually talk about that in real life. No one's sitting around in an office. Hey, are we in a bubble? No, we're just trying to make deals.
I think there are policymakers and people talking about a bubble. I mean, there was a big chart layout in the Journal this weekend about, is this an AI bubble? What are we looking at here? So there's more and more discussion about that among policymakers. There's been a lot more discussion about that in the past 6 months in DC than there was before. I just think it's some of the things just start to feel a little bit fishy. Like, Banker Bill, you were talking a couple episodes ago about these small modular nuclear companies that have never made a product and never even gotten through the whole permitting process and are hundreds of billions of dollars in valuation,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Pure plays. And I'm like, count me as a little skeptical, right? Like I used to be an energy, I cut my teeth as an energy and utilities reporter, and these guys have been saying this thing is right around the corner for the past 10 years. And like it'd be great if it is. I would love to see that happen. But you've never produced a product before and you have these huge valuations. I mean, Banker Bill, tell me how normal you think that is. I mean, that starts to seem bubblish to me, but I don't know. I let my wife handle the investments.
I would say, look, the only company these companies that are on the cutting edge, let's say of AI and are AI adjacent, like the nuclear reactor companies, the only firm that comes to mind that promised so much and was able to even come close to what they had promised over the last cycle is Tesla.
Mm.
So that's a one of one. No
And
one else has done that.
With
And,
a ton of backstopping from the government, right?
And I was just going to say, Elon Musk has needed a lot of help.
Multiple times, yeah.
So, but look, if they can if those guys over there at SpaceX can get rockets to land back down after taking off, maybe we can get Toyota Corolla-sized nuclear reactors.
That's a good way to put it. Banker Bill, I wanted to ask you because I've been thinking about this a lot. How much do you worry about all these headlines? Because I'm not very sophisticated financially, right? I just look at the tariff code. But like, how much do you worry about this sort of all of these reports of different self-dealing between the AI companies and the chip companies, and like people are making deals, and I don't know how else to describe it, but some of this seems like a little bit imaginary. You were talking about it a couple weeks ago, and I wanted to
I think
there's been more and more headlines about this.
These deals raise concerns of complexity and I would say counterparty and credit risk. Fraud risk is in there too. Much of these are typically predicated on, and I'm not saying this is or isn't, but it does seem like there is some self-dealing, but there's none explicitly. All of these commitments seem to be for things that are supposed to come into the future. Mm-hmm. And where these agreements have fallen apart in the past is you get ahead of yourself and someone in the agreement can't meet a commitment. And that commitment leads to a waterfall effect that rides downstream and affects all parties to the agreement, and it seizes up and falls apart. And either somebody goes bankrupt or somebody needs to be saved, or all the companies come crashing down.
Yeah.
And then in that case, it would take the adjacent sectors with it. So suppose the fanciful ideals of OpenAI partnering with NVIDIA, partnering with AMD, suppose all of that works out. That's probably very good for Aqua if they can make a profit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or if they can make a product, never mind a profit.
Yeah. Or new scale.
If it doesn't work out, or if it's even only half of what we think it's going to be, probably not good for the adjacent sectors.
Yeah.
Which, but that you just don't know when you're in it what it's going to be. You don't know if what you are committing to is going to be pixie dust, or if you just overinvested and now still have these capital assets that you can move. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, even if this doesn't work out, it seems like our cost of compute is going to crater, notwithstanding the problems that we have with power generation. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you can't eat cost of compute. So people are frustrated that, goods prices, food prices are rising, continue to rise over the last 5 to 6 years. And yet, I think a TV's probably never been cheaper. Mm-hmm. And you can access Chat GPT and ask it 1 million questions a day for nothing with no ads. Mm-hmm. That's where we are right now. That's it.
Who's in more danger? Google being in bed with OpenAI and the chip makers, or the NFL being in bed with the gambling companies? Who do we think is going down first?
Neither. I think
the
NFL,
a scam economy.
Yeah, the NFL is running games just because they can in Europe, and they're selling out every week. And then Microsoft and Google or Alphabet have the fortress balance sheets and cash flow that if these investments went belly up tomorrow, I think it's a hit. It doesn't kill these companies.
Maybe it doesn't kill those companies, but I can see it really impacting all those adjacent sectors, right? And so
yes,
my nightmare scenario for the economy is like, you see some sort of deflation of these AI assets, and then all of a sudden, all of the rest of the adjacent sectors that rely on these take a hit. Then the markets are taking a hit. You start to see a spiral. People are not investing anymore, and then you don't even have the upward sigh of the K-shaped recovery. Then you just have stagflation, right?
The first part you said I agree with, but then you took several leaps down the train of demand's not going to be there, and then we don't have a K-shape. We're only going down. Hey, that can happen.
That's my nightmare scenario.
I don't think AI right now is even, and I don't know this for a fact, so maybe I shouldn't say it. I don't think the AI spend and investment right now is as big as it was in the ramp up of the late 90s, early 2000s for housing.
Okay.
Too much of the American economy then was predicated on housing. That had a major effect. And if I'm using that as my proxy, I don't think we're there yet for it to have such a big impact. I think more likely, if it didn't work out, which is an if, would be something more akin to .com crash, where that really affected people who had stocks and equity holders. So
I suppose that answers my question.
but no, I mean, about how much is this talked about at work with the headlines? Look, unless it's directly impacting a client or clients bring it up, we're not talking about this stuff day to day. We're too focused on micro issues. You know, company specific, deal specific, transaction specific, right? We may be interested in things like spreads. You know, how spreads are moving. If there's a wild reaction suddenly in an interest rate, something like that. But you know, we've certainly fielded numerous calls from clients about the impacts of tariffs.
Is this corporate intertangling going to become the new norm? Is this just going to spread to other industries where we see complementary companies just become further financially enmeshed?
I could certainly see it happening. I don't think we're doing a ton. You know, there's some politically motivated antitrust probes out there, but I don't think you see the regulators being as aggressive as they were under Biden and Lena Khan, of course. You know, I think we're also seeing, this is not exactly what you asked, but I think we're seeing more and more entanglement with the US government in some of these strategic sectors, right? Like we're seeing a more kind of like state-led capitalism under Trump than I think we've seen in the past, you know, since the New Deal, right? Or maybe since like, you know, the big, you know, domestic defense industrial policies of the Cold War. And I've been really surprised that there hasn't been more outcry. I guess I shouldn't say surprised. One might think that there would have been more outcry from traditional Republican types on the US taking, you know, a stake in a critical minerals company or saying it's going to take a stake in Intel. I think there would have been a military coup if President Bernie Sanders tried to do that. I say that tongue in cheek, but you know, that those are big conceptual changes in how the US government is being involved in the economy. And I think we're going to see that expand as well, no matter who is president in 2028.
I think you didn't get the reaction you thought you would from the business community because it is what you alluded to with Bernie Sanders and Trump. We all think that with Trump, if we just get in the room with him, we can negotiate a deal. With Bernie Sanders, I don't think we'd have that. That premise going in.
He's
and
more
so, you know, you go into these things with the tariffs and whatnot, and you know, we all know that they're bullshit in the business community. Come on. And now we're seeing it. They're saying it themselves. I know I'm editorializing a bit here, but this is just really how I think. We all think that we can go in and negotiate a deal, an exclusion for a tariff, an extension, whatever it is. And so, you know, I think you would see more repudiation of, hey, what is a state capitalism? This is America. If people didn't think they could walk in and negotiate a deal that would benefit themselves or their company.
Yeah. Well, I would say I think that's true for large corporations and people whose company's leadership have personal connections with Trump or Lutnick or other people around him. But I get there's a lot of bitterness from small and medium-sized companies that don't have Howard Lutnick's phone number and can't just call him up and say, hey, I need some relief from the auto tariffs. I'm a tier 2 supplier in Western Michigan or something, right? You know, Mary Barra can do that, but there's no formal exemption process like there was in the first term for the China tariffs. It's a much more personally transactive, you know, call up one of these guys or get in the room with them. And to do that, you need a certain amount of size and political capital, right? It's not even, and Trump doesn't really like dealing with, and his team doesn't really like dealing with the industry associations, right? Whether that's Business Roundtable or the Chamber of Commerce, he wants to talk to a CEO of an individual company. And so that makes it a lot more difficult if you're a smaller, medium-sized company to kind of to make those kinds of deals. And so, you know, maybe just another instance of the little guy getting hosed. I do hear that a lot from different sources.
It makes me so angry that still business leaders would rather be humiliated by Trump and have to lose sleep at night knowing that whatever deal they negotiated with Trump could get overturned by a Trump social post tomorrow, you know, than having to suffer through a small lecture from Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders when you know they're negotiating in good faith, you know they're being transparent, and you know they're going to follow through on whatever you actually deal with them. I get that liberals can be annoying sometimes, but how can Bernie Sanders really be scarier than having to wake up one day and check whether our entire trade policy with Brazil has gotten overturned because of some court case that you've never heard of before. And I think that was on my list of questions I want to ask you, or is tangential to, we're furious here that the capitalists aren't playing by their own rules because Trump's going after the Fed and nobody's saying anything. Trump's really messing with the money, with Liberation Day, and nobody's saying anything. Banker Bill pushes back on me a lot when I say this because he's saying if you really paid attention, if you read Gavin Bade in the Wall Street Journal, if you engage more with not the regular news media, but the business news media, you see this criticism. You see people rallying around Powell. Where do you fall in that? Do you think that media outlets like the Wall Street Journal, people that should be friendly to the Fed, are doing enough to stick up for them, or have you been surprised that there hasn't been more pushback on what we sort of traditionally thought of as red lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different ways to there's a few different ways to push back, right? And I think you do see some people, not as many as I would have thought, but there are. I'm struggling. I guess I'm struggling to come up with a good example. So maybe that tells you something. But of people speaking out and saying, "Hey, we think Fed independence is important." But that's one thing. Another thing is trying to do something politically with lobbying, or there's saying and there's doing in this town, right? And I think you would see a lot more skullduggery under an activist left administration than under this populist activist administration. So I guess I've not really seen a ton of pushback in a way that they would attack certain policies they really don't like. And I agree with Banker Bill. I think it's because a lot of people just think he's transactional. He talks in a way, he deals in a way that they are very familiar with. He is he's a CEO president, and I think they are very comfortable with not only that sort of way of doing business, but that personality, right? Knowing how to, you've met guys like Trump at other companies you've done deals with, right? And you know how to kind of handle that. Whereas someone who maybe can't be bought off as easily, either ideologically or monetarily, someone like a Warren or a Bernie, it's probably more difficult for them to deal with. You know how to deal with Trump. Everyone knows how to deal with Trump. Look at what the Swiss just did. We had a great, my colleague in Switzerland did a great article of them, bringing in, oh, we're going to bring you this big engraved gold bar, and we're going to, lavish you with all these gifts. And that is what Tim Cook has done, what everyone has done. You can say that's just all for goodwill. And I think, it would be far from me to directly insinuate any sort of impropriety, but I can point out that people think they know how to deal with him. They flatter him, they give him gifts, they say how great he is. And that, in a lot of cases, that gets results, right? That is a value neutral statement. That is just an observation of what's going on. But I feel like they know how to deal with, they feel like they know how to deal with this guy. And I think that is why you see them kind of, swallow hard and keep their head down and say, well, we can live with this.
I'm not surprised to hear that Switzerland's having a lot of success applying the Nazi playbook to Trump. For me, it's the stability. It's the fact that he wakes up one day and decides that he doesn't like a Fox News headline, and it all goes poof. And to me, that's what makes me upset. Is I thought that stability was supposed to mean something. I thought that
creates winners and losers.
Yeah, I thought that slow,
Raiders
steady
love
There's winners and losers.
Yeah.
So his tweet there, whatever he is that sends out, somebody loses on that, and somebody else is a winner on that. That's the micro of it.
Banker Bill, I wanted to ask you about this as well. What do you think of like some of these accusations of, people who appear to have gotten can trade ahead of some of these big tariff announcements? There have been a few analyses I've seen that, like, okay, right before the Liberation Day announcement, a few big traders place some incredibly well-timed and lucrative trades that kind of look to get ahead of some of these announcements. Do you guys in the finance industry, do you think that there's something going on there? Does everyone feel like that's something, usually there's something that goes on in cases like that? How do you see that?
Yeah, that gets talked about more often. It looks like there is something to it. Unfortunately, the people that seem to pay the largest price for doing those kind of things is some intern who made $30,000 and just didn't follow the right steps. He didn't go buy a burner phone or create an account in the Cayman Islands. What he did was he went and called his friend, and he just didn't know how to do it right. And unfortunately, it's very hard to bring those cases, and the conviction rate, I don't know that it's particularly high on those cases. But yeah, I mean, it's right there for you all to see, and it makes it easier with things like the 0 days to expiry options.
What is that?
I don't know what that is.
It is so for years and years, consider an option. You can have an option that's 2 years out. You can have an option that's a year out. You can have an option that's 6 months out. We have options now that expire the same day. So these are just lotto tickets. And the 0 DTE options, as I understand it, these basically daily lotto tickets are what trade the most volume on a daily basis now. Not the actual shares of stock, not options further out along a curve. No, it is the 0 DTEs. So you get in, you expect that there's an announcement coming, and you go in and you buy 0 DTE options for some outrageous strike price. Because let's say whatever you're picking, it's going to move the market or some stock 50%, right? You make a bundle, you exit the same day, and that's it. I'm simplifying, but that's long and short of it. Using the 0 DTEs has made it easier to do, easier to engage in, and maybe to an extent actually easier to notice. But yeah, I mean, it's not something that we're for. I mean, all of us at banks, we're all heavily restricted on what we can invest in. For the most part, we can't invest in any individual stocks. We are only allowed to invest in ETFs or mutual funds where no single holding in those funds even exceeds 10%, right? So there's even some index funds that you might be able to go out and buy, and you don't think anything of them. But because a single holding in the index is, say, NVIDIA is 10% of some ETF or 15% of some ETF, if I were to go and buy that, I would get compliance on me. Versus, you go get in and out at 9:30 in the morning on a tariff announcement, and by 10:30 you've closed your position and made millions. Couldn't be me.
If it's not banks, then who's doing that? I mean, to explain the kind of architecture of that.
They're individuals. It could be anybody.
Yeah.
It could be something as salacious as somebody trading from within the White House. It could be somebody in a basement in Taiwan. It could be somebody on a balcony in Thailand. You don't know who knows what and when. And then how they move the orders through the system is anybody's guess. That's what makes what those people do an art form and makes them hard to get caught.
I read a report this week. Somebody was overheard saying, I can't believe all these Republicans are doing all this corruption. Don't they realize the Democrats are going to win again? And I think when it comes to the senators using the shutdown reopening to sue the DOJ, are we talking about Kristi Noem funneling money through different ad agencies? That stuff, theoretically, if there is a political will, I could see us going through and persecuting all that. Or I could see us going through and prosecuting all that. Yeah. Gavin, I'm going to edit that out. Don't you understand? The reason I say everything twice on this podcast is so I can pick the best take. But no, we can go back and prosecute all of that sort of standard government corruption. This stuff that you guys are talking about, though, right now, once that trade is done and nobody's caught it, that's over, right? We can't undo all of this insider trading, can we?
You need a couple of things. You need someone who wants to investigate it. And 2, you need a victim who would pressure someone to investigate it. And somebody who bought 0 days to expiry, same day expiry call options on take your pick. It's not going to be easy to find a victim. Everybody's out there saying, look at all this bullshit. And there's no lawman grabbing people by the ear right now. And there's really no victim.
Because the victim is the opportunity cost, is the trade that was
right. Who's on the other side of your trade? How many thousands or millions of people are on the other side of your trade who just lost at varying amounts, who got in at different times, totally undistributed, not cohesive. But look, you want to go back and prosecute all the fraud in government. Go back to the financial crisis. I think one person went to prison, some French guy. That's it. So I wouldn't hold my breath on anybody being prosecuted either for government corruption or insider trading of trade tariff announcement.
Look, on this podcast, we will never forget Martha Stewart's sacrifice to the Great Recession. We should probably start.
Can we go back to that world? That would be a good world to go back and live in. Think about that. She would never go to prison today. Do either of you think she would?
No, she would buy $100,000 of Trump crypto coin and she'd be all set.
It's down 97%, I think, since it debuted, by the way. But go on, next.
Well, my last silly question that I was going to ask you was, from education to national defense to Nicole Kidman movies, Holland, Michigan keeps finding a way to weasel its way into the national spotlight. What's the next way that Holland, Michigan is unfortunately going to, or maybe fortunately, going to pop up in the national political picture?
I think, you could see a competitive congressional race out there in the next few years, I would say. I think Holland is really interesting because I think it's really kind of like the bleeding edge of the culture war in the United States. You have this kind of blue city with a bunch of Chicago transplants, a lot of professional class people versus a very, very red county on the outside. And I think like you're just going to see more kind of flashpoints of that going forward. I think, political operators in DC, like the most diehard, like Democratic political operators, have no revolutionary tendencies stronger than a Midwestern wine mom. Like they are really down. And on the flip side, more diehard MAGA people than a small business owner in like Port Sheldon Township, Michigan, or something like that. It's really palpable, kind of, you see the societal disconnect in a lot of ways. And that sometimes worries me. You know what I mean? Thinking about, the friends back home and my family and stuff like that. I'm like, are they kind of segregating on ideological lines? And it's not that way completely, but maybe I'm seeing it slide in that direction more. So yeah, I think it's an interesting place, Holland, Michigan.
Gavin, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you making the time. We appreciate you agreeing with us so often, and we really appreciate the kind words you said about the past episodes. We're so happy to have you as a listener, and I hope we can now officially call you our first friend of the pod. To everybody listening, thank you so much. Please keep dropping us those reviews, and we'll be back at it in 2 weeks.
Thanks, fellas. It's been fun.
Yeah.
And certainly, yes, agreed with everything and nothing. Only value neutral statements only from this straight news reporter, as always.
Trump's made me agree with Kobi more in the last 6 months than I did in the prior 5 years on stuff because of how
We're
stupid
gonna
this
win
shit
so
is.
much, you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time